Okay, so today we're starting the content about from chapter 24 of your text. And this is about the post-World War II period. And most of it's going to be about American art because the sort of center of the art world moved from Paris and so on, France, basically, to the United States after the war, especially New York, partly because of the devastation of World War II. So now I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so first maybe we should talk a little bit about the historical background kind of to this art. So we talked about World War I, which was a devastating war that killed millions of, I think 10 million people around the world between 1914 and 1918. And World War I was followed by a pandemic, sort of like the one we're in now, that killed another millions of people. I'm not sure exactly how many the Spanish flu epidemic killed, but it was a lot. Almost I think as many people as died in the war were killed the next year after it ended by this influenza pandemic. And then, the economies of Europe sort of gradually recovered in the 20s and 30s, but in the 1930s, Hitler and the Nazi Party came to power in Germany and decided that because they had lost World War I, they had to start another war so they could sort of prove that they weren't losers or something. Who knows? I mean, Hitler thought that Germany needed more land, basically. And so he had planned to invade Poland and the Ukraine on the eastern front of Germany, and also to invade France on the western front. And they did invade France and Poland and the Ukraine. And the French pretty quickly surrendered, and the Germans occupied France for the rest of the war. And so for a while, the only country that was fighting against the German Nazi Party and its military machine was Great Britain. But then the Japanese, who had joined Germany in this quest to take over the world, Japan attacked the United States in late 1941, I think, or 1942. I'm not sure about the dates, but you can look it up if you want to know. That was the attack on Pearl Harbor that was completely unexpected. The United States had been neutral during the war and had not entered the war. And for some reason, the Japanese thought it would be in their interest to bomb Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. And as a result, the United States declared war on Japan and on Germany. And we entered the war on the side of Great Britain and France in 1942. And so that was the beginning of World War II for Americans. And a lot of Americans served in World War II. You may have great-grandparents maybe who were involved in World War II. So there was a huge national mobilization, and millions of Americans went to Europe or to the Pacific to fight in World War II. And eventually our side prevailed and we liberated France, Paris. We liberated the concentration camps in Eastern Europe, and the Nazis lost and Hitler committed suicide. So, and Germany had been basically flattened by aerial bombing by that time, along with a lot of the other cities of Europe. So in World War I, there was shelling, but in World War II, there was aerial bombardment on the cities on London, which we talked about earlier in the class, but also the Allies, that is the United States and Great Britain, bombed German cities and firebombed them, which is kind of a war crime, really. But, was all for the cause. And then the United States also bombed, with using nuclear weapons, bombed Japan, specifically Hiroshima, and then Nagasaki. And so when that happened, the Japanese surrendered and the war was over. So the art of, since Europe was completely devastated by this war, a lot of European artists immigrated to New York City and started a kind of what was later called the New York School. That is a school of painting, a group of painters, not a literal school like a school you go to and get grades and things, but a school meaning a group of like-minded people. So the New York School was mostly American painters or European expatriates, but some of them were taught by European painters who had immigrated. So one of these teachers was Hans Hofmann, and one of his students was Jackson Pollock. So Pollock became the kind of rock star American artist of the post-war, immediate post-war period. So we're going to talk about Pollock, and then and about the school, the sort of art movement that he pioneered and some of his friends, called abstract expressionism. And then the second part of the lecture is going to be about pop art, which came along a little bit later and was invented by Andy Warhol and some other people. So first we're going to talk about Pollock. So Pollock was, he grew up in Wyoming or something. He was a very American guy. He was not European at all. He'd never been to Europe. He didn't serve, and I'm not really sure why he wasn't in the army, I don't think. But after the war, he took painting courses from some European teachers, including this guy, Hans Hofmann. And by this time, the whole avant-garde in painting had moved away from any sort of representational or naturalistic painting. It was all about abstraction. That is, if you wanted to be a cutting-edge painter, you would be an abstract painter. But Pollock really took abstraction to the next quantum level, you could say. Like, he didn't, normally when people abstracted, like with Cubism or Fauvism or something like that, the artist would start with something in nature, like, a person playing, or in real life, let's say, a person playing a guitar in a bar. And then they would sort of distort it and abstract it using Cubist ideas, for example, to make it look not like a person playing a guitar. I mean, you have to sort of look carefully to see the guitar and see the person and all that. But what Pollock did was he just threw that out the window. He was like, you don't have to start with something that you can see. And what he did, his big breakthrough came when Pollock was an alcoholic, and his wife, Lee Krasner, who was also a painter, finally decided that they had to move away from New York so that he couldn't hang out with his drinking buddies anymore. And they moved to Long Island, and they moved to a little, sort of like a small farm there that had a shed in the backyard. And that became Pollock's studio. And so what he started doing out there in that shed in the late 40s and early 50s was he would unroll a roll of canvas. You can buy the canvas for painting in a big roll. I have one in my closet upstairs. And he just unrolled it on the floor of this the concrete floor of this shed, and he just started dripping paint onto the canvas on the floor. In other words, it was not vertical on an easel. It was like normal painting. It was flat, horizontal on the floor. And he didn't always use traditional artist oil paint. He used paint from the hardware store. He used a kind of liquid enamel paint that he could suck up with a turkey baster and, for example, and just squirt onto the canvas. Or he would take sticks or old paintbrushes and just stick them in a can. The paint came in a can, and just fling it across the canvas that way. So normally when I would teach this course in person, we'd watch a video of Pollock painting, and there's those videos are in the content. So rather than take time in this video to show you those videos, I think you should go watch the videos that show how Pollock painted, so you can really understand how radically different this was. And Pollock himself acknowledged that, he was doing something pretty radical. And he actually asked his wife, Lee Krasner, one day, is this a painting? Not, is this a good painting, but is it a painting at all? And because he was going about it in a completely different way than anybody had ever painted before. And there's a movie about Pollock where Krasner comes out to this little shed and sees the painting on the floor, which is completely abstract in the sense, and non-representational in the sense that it doesn't start with something in nature. It just is. It's the result of this process of flinging the paint onto the canvas. And Lee Krasner says, "You've done it, Pollock. You've cracked it wide open," meaning you've taken abstract painting as far as it can possibly go. And this became a problem for Pollock, which we'll talk about in a minute. But his teacher, Hans Hofmann, said to Pollock, "Do you like to paint nature?" And Pollock said, "I am nature." So that gets to another thing about Pollock's painting. So let's just, okay. So he saw it as a kind of reflection of his own inner self, his own subjectivity, that when he was painting in this way, his interior turmoil or conflict or whatever would come out onto the canvas. He was not a happy person, and he did have a lot of emotional issues. And as I said, he had this drinking problem that he temporarily escaped from on Long Island, but he didn't stay sober. It got bad again later. So this internal unhappiness or conflict or subjectivity, which he was so interested in, he was interested in Freud and Jung and the unconscious and all that. He thought it would kind of come out in his painting. So it was kind of, when he says, "I am nature," that is, this painting is a reflection of my own interior life, kind of. But critics, and Pollock became very successful very fast. These paintings were snapped up by collectors, and he made a lot of money pretty fast. He became a big success. His picture was in Life magazine and so on. But what critics focused on, or at least certain critics, was the fact that the paintings had this quality of all overness. That is, and that's not entirely new. At the Khan Academy video about Monet's paintings, the water lilies that we already talked about, one of the art historians points out that there's a kind of all over quality of Monet's water lilies paintings and a kind of flatness to them that later became more explicit in Pollock's work. So the avant-garde in painting, according to art historians and critics, was moving towards flatness and away from, Renaissance illusionism in terms of perspective and all that. Rather, the avant-garde painter of the mid-20th century was acknowledging that the canvas was flat and that what he or she was doing was just putting paint on this flat surface. And there was no attempt to create an illusion of deep space or anything like that. That was all kind of BS, European BS. And that it was kind of a lie even to try to do that. And you had to be honest about the fact that the canvas was a flat two-dimensional surface like a curtain that you would just you were just putting colors on, and that's what it really was. So that's kind of uh the take that critics of the time and art historians now kind of had about this, was that the radical innovation here was to see painting as a process, not a product. That is, and they even called it action painting. And the movie of Pollock painting shows you, that was true. Pollock is moving around the canvas. He circles the canvas, throwing paint on it. So there's no up, there's no down. It's almost like a dance. And this is a record of this dance around the canvas. And Pollock was really good at this. A lot of people, when they see this painting, just say, oh, well, anybody could do it. And that's true. You could do this. And there's a video in the content that basically shows you how to do it. There's an artist who teaches in New York, and he shows you how you could basically make a painting like this. But as Pollock practiced this over the years, he got really good at controlling the flow of paint off the end of his stick. So it wasn't completely random. That is, he could make it go where he wanted it to. And you or I, if we tried to do this, we might get a result that's interesting, but we wouldn't be able to control the flow of the paint the way that Pollock could. So, yeah. Okay, so this is normally I hand out a piece of paper with some quotes from Pollock and other painters from this era, but since I can't give you this handout right now, I'm going to upload it to the content. I just put some quotes from it in the slideshow here. So this is a quote from Pollock. My painting does not come from the easel. So an easel is a upright sort of holder for a canvas. I hardly ever stretch my canvas before painting. I prefer to tack the unstretched canvas to the hard wall or the floor. On the floor, I'm more at ease. I feel nearer, more a part of the painting, since this way I can walk around it, work from the four sides, and be literally in the painting. I prefer sticks, trowels, knives, and dripping fluid paint or heavy impasto with sand, broken glass, or other foreign matter added. When I'm in my painting, I'm not aware of what I'm doing. The painting has a life of its own. I try to get it, oops, a typo there. I try to get it to come through. The source of my painting is the unconscious. So that's Pollock's theory about that's what he thought he was doing. And, it made him rich and successful. He was profiled in Life magazine, compared to Picasso. And if the movie about Pollock is right, it sort of went to his head. He was not especially modest person. So this series kind of continued, and this is actually a little earlier painting. He numbered the paintings, and sometimes he gave them titles that kind of suggest he kept calling them one. I'm not really sure why. But it's almost as if there's a kind of unity here in the all overness. That is, it's not like there's something happening over here that's different from what's happening over here. It's just kind of this undifferentiated mass of lines, and mostly lines, actually. So, and that's one of the other sort of interesting things about this from a formal point of view to a painter, is that Pollock has kind of abandoned certain elements of art, like shapes or shapes with colors inside the shape. It's all about this line, this sort of meandering line that's sometimes broken, sometimes unbroken, and the layering of a sort of network of lines in one or two or maybe three colors here. So he's kind of reduced painting to its most, in a way, its most basic element, which is line. Now there's still color here, and there's still a sort of atmosphere, but the atmosphere is not, or mood is not created by shapes or colors. It's just created by these lines that overlap each other. All right, so here's a statement that I think explains this pretty well. And don't worry if some of these words are unfamiliar, or you don't understand every bit of what Rosalind Krauss is saying here, but just, I think you'll understand enough of it that it'll help. Okay. So Krauss says, by returning painting to the field of the horizontal, that is laid on the floor, not vertical on an easel, Pollock attacked all these subliminatory forces: uprightness, the upright easel, the gestalt, the thing having to hang together, form, beauty. At least this was the conviction held by many of the artists convinced by the anti-form drive of his work. That the works were returned to a formal decorousness by being hung vertically did not deter them. That is, he painted them on the floor, but then when they were shown in a gallery or a museum, they're exhibited vertically on the wall as if they were painted on an easel. But you can still tell they were painted on the floor. The traces of process, that is the floor process, the puddling, the scabbing, the lateral ooze of liquid onto cloth, are all marks of the horizontal, marks that continue to disrupt the uprightness of the work, its effective coming together as image. All the other abstract expressionists worked on easels or with their canvas tacked directly to the wall. This meant that in de Kooning's work, liquid paint would form vertical runoff, that is, drips running this way. The spatters would themselves be oriented towards form, that is, they could look even like a figure, right? They're vertical like you are when you stand up. Pollock alone resisted this, and such resistance maintains itself in any view of his work, a horizontal anti-form as an abstractness uncolonized by the vertical one. So maybe. I mean, this typical sort of vague art speak, but I think it does get to something that's important in Pollock's work. Okay, so she mentioned de Kooning, who was a friend of Pollock's and also an abstract expressionist in the same era. And they were constantly looking at each other's work, sort of like Braque and Picasso in the early 20th century. But de Kooning was a European. He was trained in academic art, and he was trained to draw in an academic, Renaissance way when he was a student. But when he came to New York, he began painting semi-abstractly as a sort of action painter and a member of the New York School. So, there is a figure here. This is Woman One, as he calls it. And there's a video about this that in the content that you should look at. So there's many, many layers to Woman One. He worked on this canvas for a long time, I think over a year, and he just kept layering more on and scraping things away. And finally, he just kind of stopped. I don't know how he decided where to stop, but there is a figure here, this kind of terrifying looking woman with enormous breasts and feet who seem to be in sort of pointy shoes of some sort, and maybe a skirt. It's not clear where her arms are. Maybe these are her hands. What's this? Is this a hat? I don't know. But she's pretty scary looking. Now, the art historians on the Khan Academy site and elsewhere have pointed out that de Kooning was influenced somewhat by advertising posters that showed in the early 1950s that showed, sort of sexy women dressed up advertising cigarettes or liquor or cars or whatever. And, as a child of the 50s, I remember those ads. And actually, the makeup and dress of women in the 1950s was scary. It was a little bit intimidating. My mother wore very bright red lipstick, like super red. And there was a lot of eye makeup and a lot of teeth, as sort of is exemplified here, and these terrifying brassieres that made women's breasts into like pointy guided missiles or something that you could poke your eye out, literally. I mean, if you ran up and hugged your mother and one of the ends of one of her bras went in your eye, it seemed like you could be blinded. I mean, they were very pointy. If you want to research that on the internet, go look at it. You can't believe how pointy these bras were. They were terrifying. But that was just the style. And so women looked intimidating, I feel like, during this era. That was supposed to be good. It was supposed to be sexy. This unnaturally red lipstick, this blue eyeshadow, and these extremely pointy bras that were everywhere. And so that may be part of the source of de Kooning's kind of terror here, making this very intimidating looking woman. But from a formal point of view, that's I was talking about the content and the context there. When we talk about the formal qualities of this, you can see the kind of slashing brushstrokes and the thick impasto paint. De Kooning experimented a lot with paint, like Pollock. He mixed oil paint with all kinds of weird things, even just with water sometimes. And he either thinned it down or thickened it. And he painted, sort of like this with these slashing gestures. Again, there's a video about how he painted, where a contemporary artist sort of replicates de Kooning's methods, and I'll make sure that's in the content so that you can see it. Let me write that down. But the point here is the whole action painting idea. Okay, so I'm going to read this little quote from Harold Rosenberg, a critic in the 1950s. The canvas began to appear as an arena on which to act, rather than as a space in which to reproduce, redesign, analyze, or express a subject. That is, instead of painting the oath of the Horatii, a story from Roman mythology, it's not that primarily. It's a place to do something, to execute a process. What was to go on the canvas was not a picture, but an event. The painter no longer approached his easel with an image in mind. He went up to it with material in his hand, that is paint, to do something to that other piece of material in front of him. The image would be the result of this encounter. So the emphasis was on the materials, the canvas, the paint, and the process, rather than the emphasis being on, oh, is this a picture of, the 3rd of May, where the French soldiers shot a bunch of Spanish civilians. I mean, that whole idea of a picture telling a story, kind of like a movie or something, that's all gone. There may be a figure here, but the important thing in the view of critics of the time was not the figure or the story or anything like that. It was the process and the formal considerations and just the fact that this is a flat surface on which paint is being put, you could say. Okay, so this was a very macho kind of thing, the New York School and abstract expressionism. It was very American. It was like, yeah, we're not these effete French painters. We're action heroes, you know, da da da. We're manly men, but we paint. But there were a few women who were part of this abstract expressionism thing, like Lee Krasner, Pollock's wife, and Helen Frankenthaler. And Helen Frankenthaler also did some pouring, like Pollock, on the floor, but she used acrylic paint, and she kind of pioneered the use of very dilute acrylic washes onto canvas. And she wasn't, I mean, it was a kind of action painting, I guess you could say. But when you read Helen Frankenthaler's writing about her work, really, she was more concerned with formal considerations, like what color goes with what. So this is maybe called Mountains and Sea, but it's not primarily a picture of a scene in nature. It's more about, according to her, it's more about how these colors go together and where she places them on the canvas in a purely formal considerations, just as sort of like what Matisse said when we were studying expressionism and fauvism. He said, you know, if I put something down over here, then that changes everything over here, and I have to kind of reconsider the whole painting every time I put a new color or shape there. So that's kind of Helen Frankenthaler's approach to this type of painting. Okay, but sure, you know, that the whole abstract expressionism New York school, well, let's say the New York school is sort of divided into two camps, you could say, abstract expressionism and pop. So for a while, abstract expressionism was the thing. It was all the rage. But in the early 1960s, pop posed a kind of challenge to abstract expressionism. And of all the, there's a lot of pop artists, but the one we're going to talk about is Andy Warhol. So Andy Warhol was really a commercial artist, a graphic designer. He made illustrations for advertisements. He made photographs for advertisements. He made his living really creating advertisements, but he also had his own sort of practice as a fine artist, you could say. But his fine art practice was deeply influenced by his work as a commercial artist, as I think you'll see in these slides. So the first one we're going to look at is from the early 60s, the Maryland diptych. Okay, so I think if a lot of people will recognize the woman in the Maryland diptych as Marilyn Monroe, who was an important movie star in the late 50s and early 60s, but she died tragically in the early 1960s of a apparent drug overdose, but some people thought maybe she committed suicide. Note, Marilyn Monroe is not the same as Marilyn Manson. So there have been students in the past who have mixed the two up. So let's just get that straight. Marilyn Monroe was a woman who was a movie star, and she was in a lot of sort of romantic comedies in the 1950s, and she was kind of a sex symbol. I mean, she was considered to be the most beautiful woman imaginable, sort of like I don't know, Beyonce or something. She was just a superstar. And allegedly she had an affair with John Kennedy, President Kennedy. I think that's pretty certain, but she also was having affairs with various mafia guys. And, you know, conspiracy theorists think that maybe the mafia shot JFK or arranged the assassination of JFK. So her whole role in that is still kind of ambiguous, but fascinating. Anyway, so this is about Marilyn, and Andy Warhol made it after she died. So let's just sort of think about this. So first of all, what is a diptych? Okay, so a diptych is two panels or two paintings, separate canvases, you could say, that are hung side by side. And originally they were religious diptychs, and they would be joined by a hinge maybe, so that they could stand up on a little home altar. So you might have a Madonna and a child here and a crucifixion over here, and this would be a diptych. So that's what we have here, and it's big. It's like a medieval altarpiece or something, as you can see, compared to the person standing here looking at it. But it's weird because on this side, it's color, and on this side is black and white, and it's kind of smudged here. So what was Warhol thinking or doing? Okay, so what he did, he started with a photograph, and he didn't take this photograph. He just appropriated it, which means he just kind of stole it. It's a publicity still from Marilyn's studio, whoever she was working for at the time. Movie stars used to be signed to movie studios, and then the studio would just tell them what movie to be in. They didn't have a lot of autonomy. So this was publicity still of Marilyn. Okay, so he made a silkscreen image of her. So what is a silkscreen? So what he did was he took this black and white photograph, and he through various processes, he made a silkscreen of the black lines, but then he also made silk screens for these other colors, the yellow color, the pink color or magenta of her face, the blue of her eyeshadow and her collar, the red of her mouth, the white of her teeth, and the orange background. Okay, all of those were separate screens. Each color has its own screen. So when you make a silk screen print, you go over it as many times as there are colors, basically. So maybe you screen the black image ink first, and then maybe you screen the yellow, use the yellow screen, then use the magenta screen, then you use the red one, and so on, like that. So each color has its own screen, and you have to line each one up perfectly. But once you have the screens, anybody can do it. That is, Warhol didn't have to do it himself. In fact, his studio was called the Factory. And he had hired people to screen his silk screen prints for him. And he made a lot of these of different things. We're going to see some others in a minute. But you can see that he also, all right, so on this side, there's a grid with 5 columns and 5 rows. So 25 more or less identical portraits of Marilyn. But on this side, it's the same size grid, but with 25 images of Marilyn, but they're in black and white, and some of them don't look so good. Some of them there's too much black ink, or there's not enough black ink to the point that she just seems to be fading away. So an interesting question that you could write about this painting for your question tomorrow would be something about what is Warhol's purpose here? Like, why does he obscure her face almost completely in some of the squares here? or make her fade away almost completely in some of the squares here? And why are there two panels, one with her in color and one with her not in color? And why does her face look so flat? Why is her image, the image of Marilyn, flattened out like this? You know, she's the photograph. I mean, when you make a photograph with a flash, it does kind of flatten the image a little bit. But this, the photograph shows the volume of her face more or less. But the silk screen gets rid of some of that modeling. It oversimplifies her face. And so her head no longer looks rounded. He's also kind of slightly exaggerated the length of her face a little bit. So a good question for about any artwork is to think about what was the artist's purpose here? Why did he make the decisions that he made? Why did he, first of all, why did he repeat the image over and over? In another image of Marilyn made from the same silk screens, he just places one head of Marilyn within this gold field and called it Gold Marilyn. So it's almost like a medieval icon or a Byzantine icon, like an object of worship, which Marilyn kind of was an object of worship. I mean, she was a celebrity. She was a huge star. So maybe he's making some sort of comparison between Marilyn, the movie star, and, you know, religious figures like the Virgin Mary or something. So he did do that. But if that's the case, why did he do this one this way? Why did he repeat her image over and over? And why did he fade her out over here? So those are some things we can talk, you can write about, a question about, maybe speculate about your ideas about why, and then we can talk about it in the discussion period on Friday. Okay, so when I first learned about pop art, I knew that it was related to advertising and popular culture, that is consumerism, you know, which became a much bigger thing in the 50s and 60s than it had ever been before. I mean, that was the era where convenience food sort of came into its own. Not that canned food hadn't existed before, but it proliferated. And, you know, my mother was very interested in convenience food. She didn't really like cooking, and she bought a lot of canned soup and Velveeta and that kind of thing. But the grid thing, I didn't understand until one day I walked into the All Good Walmart and I saw this display. I took this picture of Velveeta cartons, and I just, a light bulb went on. I was like, oh, so that's what Warhol was thinking about. And I think it really was. I mean, each one of these cartons is a print, right? I mean, it's not a fine art print, but it is a print similar to these prints. Okay, so Warhol had his employees silk screen these one at a time, and these are printed in a factory, but they're still printed, not silk screen. I don't know how they print them, offset printing or something. But each carton is a print. And then they're stacked in a store on a pallet or on the shelves in a grid. I mean, somebody kind of disrupted the grid a little bit here by putting the backside forward, but mostly they're stacked exactly the same. And same goes for other products in the supermarket. They're all stacked in a grid facing you, either on a pallet or on a shelf. I mean, you can see in the background here, some, hadn't noticed that before, but this pallet of sugar was standing in front of, it looks like some Campbell's soup can. So that's a kind of fortunate coincidence. So Warhol made a lot of art about consumer culture. I mean, you could say in a way that that's what his art is about. And this is an example of that. Green Coca-Cola bottles. Okay, so when I was a kid in the early 60s, Coke did not come in a can, and it didn't come in a plastic bottle. It came in a 6-ounce glass bottle, about that tall. So you didn't get very much, not as much as you get now if you go to a fountain or whatever. You got a small serving of Coke in a green bottle, and they were glass. And these bottles were filled in Coca-Cola bottling plants all over the country, and especially in the South, because Coca-Cola started in Atlanta, I think. So even small towns like Lebanon, Tennessee, and probably Cookeville had their own Coca-Cola bottling plants where, and when you were finished drinking the Coke, you brought the bottle back. You returned the bottle, which seems incredible now. We just throw everything away. But even as recently as the 1960s, people returned containers like this. So you bought a Coke from a Coke machine, you drank it standing right there in front of the machine, and then you just put it back in this wooden crate next to the machine. And then the bottle would be taken to a Coca-Cola bottling plant. It would be washed and refilled and recapped. And people actually manually clean these bottles at those bottling plants. My dad's first job ever was taking a brush and brushing the inside of the bottles at the local bottling plant in the little town in North Carolina where he grew up. So, it's kind of incredible now. But these bottles, on the bottom of the bottle, it would tell you what city the bottle was made in. Like it might say Nashville, Tennessee, or Atlanta, Georgia. And it was always interesting to me to turn the bottle over when I was done drinking my Coke and look at where it came from. And some of them were worn. They were old. They had been filled and washed and refilled many times. So some looked new and some looked old. And I think Warhol sort of got that in this print. I mean, he used the same screen over and over, right? Each one of these bottles is printed in using the same silk screen, and the ink is squeezed through the screen. But each one is slightly different. Some bottles look older than others. Some of them looked almost like sea glass, really. And so, but for him, the important thing was the uniformity of American consumer culture. This is a quote from Warhol about that. What's great about this country is that America started the tradition where the richest consumers buy essentially the same thing as the poorest. You could be watching TV and see Coca-Cola, and you can know that the president drinks Coke. Liz Taylor drinks Coke. Liz Taylor was another movie star. And just think you can drink Coke too. A Coke is a Coke, and no amount of money can get you a better Coke. So again, you see that grid that's reminiscent of the display of products in a supermarket or in a Coke machine, or indeed when you return the Coke to the crate. The crate was a grid. It was a wooden box with square openings, each one for a bottle. I can't remember how many bottles were in a crate. Not that many, because the crates could get heavy when they were full of glass and Coke. But still, it was a grid of a sort. And I'm sure that Warhol didn't miss that. All right. So one of Warhol's most famous paintings, you could say, and this is actually a painting, not a silkscreen. The previous things we looked at were silkscreen. But one of his first works about consumerism, or about American consumer culture, were these soup cans things. And I think the Museum of Modern Art owns this, so you can see it in New York. And each one is different. Okay, so he basically copied Campbell's soup cans, and it's the grid, right? Each can looks exactly the same, but each one is labeled slightly different according to what flavor it is. And the only thing really that's mechanized about this is the little fleur-de-lis around the bottom of the edge of the can. He had a stamp that he inked or put paint on, and he stamped those little fleur-de-lis, but he painted everything, all of the rest of these by hand, one at a time. So each one of these is a separate painting. You can see that each one has its own little frame. And apparently at the Museum of Modern Art, they display these in the order that Campbell's came out with that flavor. I don't know if this picture is arranged that way, but Andy Warhol was a big fan of Campbell's soup. He said he ate the same lunch every day for 20 years, which was Campbell's tomato soup and a grilled cheese sandwich. And Warhol had all these little sayings, these little axioms. And one of them was, I want to be a machine. I like boring things. I like things to be exactly the same over and over. So that's what he painted. and the question really becomes, did he really like this, or is he being ironic? Like the question for critics, and again, you could raise this in your own question writing, is this a celebration of American consumer culture, or is it a critique of American consumer culture? That is the uniformity of the food that we all buy, is that great, or is that kind of scary? Is the fact that we turn celebrities into basically commodities for mass consumption, is that fun, or is that horribly destructive, especially maybe to the celebrities themselves, who are no longer really individuals, but just a product that the movie studio markets to the rest of us, at least in this era? I mean, I think Beyonce, if you're going to compare Marilyn to another celebrity, she has a lot of control over her work and over how she presents herself and what she does. I mean, she's, pretty autonomous as an artist. But back in the 60s, really, actors and celebrities like Marilyn didn't have the same autonomy. They were products of the movie studio, and they kind of had to do what the movie studio told them to do. And in Marilyn's case, it kind of erased her actual self, it seems. In fact, that wasn't even really her name. I can't remember what her real name was, but Marilyn Monroe was her stage name. And she was from the Midwest somewhere, from a very ordinary background, I think. You can look that up on Wikipedia if you want to know what her real name was. Okay, so Warhol, getting back to this question of, is it critique or is it celebration? I think these prints help us figure that out. All right, so he had a series of prints called the Disaster series. And this may be a little confusing at first, but when you first look at it, it was White Burning Car. Okay, so what Warhol did in this case was he took a newspaper photograph of a car accident where a car had turned over and was on fire. If you look a little more carefully, you can see that the horror here is that the passenger was flung from the car and kind of ended up suspended on, apparently dead, and maybe impaled on this utility pole. So back in the 60s, utility poles had these wire steps so that the lineman, but not all municipalities had a bucket truck where you could go be lifted up to service the lines. There was kind of like a ladder made out of wire, of metal, that went up the pole, and evidently this poor guy got thrown against the pole and kind of hung there on the pole, and I'm guessing he was dead. But then behind him, there's just another guy just kind of casually walking through his yard as if nothing has happened, right? So Warhol sees this photograph, he turns it into a silkscreen matrix and reproduces it 5 times and for some reason leaves this square blank and calls it White Burning Car. So one of the things that Warhol said about disasters kind of in general and media photographs of disasters was that when you see the same horror over and over, it sort of ceases to horrify you, you know. Um, and so in a way, I feel like this, again, we have the question of, is this a celebration of American newspaper media, or is it kind of a critique of the way that Americans started consuming sensational news by way of sensational and horrifying photographs? Okay, so another print in this series is called Lavender Disaster. And in this case, it's a photograph of the room where they executed prisoners using the electric chair. So it's a little bit hard to see in this slide, but the electric chair is right here in the background. So until some time in the 1960s, capital punishment in America was still done with the electric chair. This was before a lethal injection. And there had been some kind of notorious executions using the electric chair during the Red Scare era of the 1950s, where there was a kind of mass hysteria about communists infiltrating the American government. And two people, a couple actually, a man and a wife, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, were executed by electric chair because they were thought to be Russian spies or something. And there was just this, it was the McCarthy era in the 1950s. So this was made in 1963, but in the not that long before, there had been this so-called Red Scare in the McCarthy era where people were being accused of being communist spies and, you know, sometimes executed or imprisoned, or at the very least fired from their job and disgraced. So, but Warhol calls it lavender disaster. So he uses a kind of lavender color here and reproduces this electric chair scene. And again, it's really hard to see, but there's a sign over in the corner somewhere that says silence, which is a little bit scary or kind of somber thing to think about. Like when a person was executed in the electric chair, I guess, I mean, it was done secretly. You didn't see the person. There was no, the executions were carried out in private, as they still are. So, and there was a kind of, I guess there was a kind of silence around that. Like it's hard to know exactly how many people are being executed in America right now without doing a little digging. It doesn't make the papers usually, unless there's some controversy. When I lived in Texas, Texas executes a lot of people. And I photographed a prison where the executions were done near Houston. And the prison is called the Walls Unit. And the death chamber for the whole state of Texas is in Huntsville, Texas, in the Walsh Unit. And I photographed the death chamber, actually. So I learned a little bit about execution, the death penalty in Texas. And I learned that they were when I lived there in the late 90s and early aughts, they were executing somebody every 2 weeks. And it didn't really make the newspaper unless there was some controversy about the person being executed, like if they were mentally disabled or something like that. And there was somebody who was mentally disabled who was executed not that long ago. And I remember there was a big controversy about that. But otherwise, it just all went on kind of in secret, you could say. It wasn't literally secret, but there was a lot of silence around the fact that they were executing somebody just about every 2 weeks. The day that I photographed the death chamber, somebody had been executed the night before. It was just a common occurrence. So that little sign that says silence, I think, is maybe speaks to that, but who knows? It was part of the photograph that Warhol got hold of. The question remains lavender. Like, why lavender? And I have my own thoughts about that. I'm just going to go ahead and tell you, but it's just my interpretation. There was also sort of concurrent to the Red Scare, there was something called the Lavender Scare. And the Lavender Scare was sort of the twin brother, you could say, of the Red Scare. The Lavender Scare was that there were a lot of gay people, well, gay men in the United States government, and that because they were gay, they were probably disloyal to the United States, and they were probably communists, and they were probably spies. And they if it were found out that you were a gay man working in, I don't know, the State Department or something, then you would get fired and disgraced and never hired again. And that happened to some prominent physicists and mathematicians who were working for the Defense Department. I can't remember their names right now, but there were several. Alan Turing, actually, the guy who made some of the most important discoveries that led to the invention of the computer. Turing was a gay guy, but I think he was an Englishman. I think that all went down in England. But anyway, there was this sort of lavender, it's called the Lavender Scare. For some reason, lavender is associated with being a gay man. I don't know why. But Andy Warhol was gay himself. He was pretty out, and maybe you could say out and proud. I'm not sure, but I mean, all his friends knew he was gay. And it's possible that there's something, the choice of lavender here and the phrase, the Lavender Scare, and the electric chair are all sort of connected in his mind to make some sort of critique about the persecution of so-called deviant people in America at the time. Anybody who was maybe too European or too seemed kind of homosexual or something like that. But I hope that you'll come up with your own questions about Warhol and abstract expressionism, and also the preceding lecture about, I think it was about surrealism. That was 2 days ago. I can't remember. So, yeah, and we'll talk about it on Friday. So I'm going to stop my share now. Now, again, I'd like to point out that you can do a presentation yourself in the last week of classes and get some extra credit on your participation grade that way. So if you decide that that's something you want to do, you should message me about it so I can schedule a time for you to do that, either present just to me or to everybody. We can invite everybody via Zoom if you want to. And also which artist you intend to present about. So let's say your participation grade now is 85, you could possibly, raise it to 95. So think about that. And if you have any, and there's a module in the content that explains how to do it and how to pick your artist and everything. So, but if you decide to do it, just let me know that you want to do it. So I'm going to stop recording and I'm going to end the meeting.